for having me. It really is an honor to be here talking to you at a university. My father was a professor, and it has always been a dream of mine that one day I would teach at a university level. So being here is, a dream come true. And also, I think of architecture as a guild in the old-fashioned way, in which you have masters and you have apprentices. And when you lead your own office, you're the master and you're obligated to teach. So I teach every day. My employees, they're my apprentices, and I have an obligation to teach them so that they work for me and they do beautiful work, but also so that they become architects, because when you leave school, your education journey is not finished. You have to report almost 4,000 hours of practice. And so it is our duty as registered architects to keep on teaching you. I'm going to talk to you about biophilic design, which is really just a vehicle to tell you a little bit about myself. And so the lecture is called Musings on Biophilia. I'll start reading here. My name is Nadia Palacios Lauterbach, that's my married name. I am a mother, I am a wife, I am Hispanic, and I am an architect. I call my lecture Musings on Biophilia because I want to tell you about ideas and stories that at times might feel unrelated. So, I'm going to ramble a little bit. That's where the musings comes from. But I plan to weave these stories into a connected narrative about who I am as an architect, in the hopes that it might help you all in your individual journeys towards becoming architects. And you can see these are the learning objectives. And it's going to be a very personal lecture. So what is biophilia? It is an innate and genetically determined affinity of human beings with the natural world. And biophilic architecture is a design approach that integrates nature into the built environment to improve human health, well-being, and productivity by tapping into our innate biological connection to nature. So the inspiration for the lecture came to me last year because I went to a continuing education class, which you have to do to maintain your license. And there were these two interior designers giving a talk on biophilic design. And they were talking about it as if it was this buzzword, and it was like the new kid on the block, what biophilic design was. And they kept showing us, how you can make your buildings more connected with nature by having a picture of a tree. And that research shows that patients heal better if they can see nature. And so their answer to that was putting pictures of plants in patient rooms. And that got me thinking, that just seemed very artificial. It didn't seem natural. And so this sounds like a new concept. Magazines and publications are certainly making us feel like it's an innovative way of thinking. And we see buildings incorporating gardens on their facades, trees in their hallways, and installations of moss art. So there we have, and I'm not telling you where it is or what they are, because I consider that random moments of nature. And here we have a hallway, and there are some trees, and then there is a building that reflects the nature around it, and then there is a very sterile hallway with moss on the walls, and they call that biophilic design. And I'm very biased here because I have a classical education, but I'm not feeling connected to nature in any of those designs. So biophilic design involves the use of natural materials, natural light, and plans to create a more pleasing and effective built environment. It works on the principle that humans have evolved toward in and with the natural environment for millions of years, and that we are not well adapted to the urban industrial environment in existence for only the past 200 years or so. So this is what our buildings look like now. And again, I'm not telling you where they are because it sort of doesn't matter. They don't have a sense of place. They don't have a sense of context. They could be anywhere. And one thing that they all have in common is that They don't have any connection to nature. They don't have any sense of scale. They're kind of hostile. That one on the, oh, and I have the pointer here. This one over here, you have an ancient building here, and then you have all of that. So this ancient building kind of gives you some idea that it's in the Middle East. But if I were to see that, I wouldn't know where that is. And it's certainly not connected, to nature. So our modern buildings have become increasingly monolithic, objects in a field without our relationship to one another and without our connection to the natural world around us. It is no wonder that schools of thought are advocating for a return to nature in this novel concept of biophilia. And we find ourselves trying to satisfy this need by incorporating random moments of nature in our buildings. So, if we just put a tree in the lobby of that building, maybe we will feel more connected to nature. I obviously disagree. The reality is that humans have been practicing biophilic design for thousands of years, building shelters with what they had in response to their climate. These shelters were practical. They helped people stay warm or cool, protected them from weather, and helped preserve food and other possessions. But these dwellings often did much more. They were expressions of culture, reinforcing and reflecting people's traditions and spiritual beliefs. So here we have Mesa Verde by the Anasazi people. And I went to the Natural History Museum in Salt Lake City this morning, and I saw petroglyphs at the exhibit, and I also saw images and some remnants of adobe shelters like this one. And I learned that the first people here in Utah are related to the Pueblo people in Mesa Verde. And what is incredible about Mesa Verde, if you've ever been there, is that they mimic the rock. And I was saying to one of your professors that the museum, and it's a very modern building that I normally don't like, but it is actually biophilic in design because it mimics the mountain behind it. And so it does very much what this is doing. And for the Anasazi people, they were blending into the rock, and there's a gorge right here, and they were more spectators. They were watching nature, from this cave in which they had sheltered, but they were mimicking the world around them. And then we have lotus capitals here at the hypostyle hall in Luxor, where the Egyptians are being inspired by the reeds of the Nile and the flowers, and their columns are made as if you have, the branches of these flowers, and everything is colorful, and everything is open, and they're celebrating how the Nile floods the banks and makes their land fertile. And then here we have in Pompeii the house of Neander, where the house revolves around these courtyards. And Roman houses had different courtyards for different purposes. And then their triclinium, which is a dining room, is decorated with all of this beautiful nature here, which, by the way, looks like a Bigorre wallpaper, which I put in a lot of my projects. If I were to show this to some of my colleagues, they would think that it's actually something that you can buy. So then here we have one of my favorite places in the world, which is the Generalife Palace at the top of the hill in the Alhambra in Granada. And here we have a palace in India, and a tea pavilion in China, and a courtyard house in Japan, and we have a diagram of a Chinese courtyard house. These are different climates and they're different places. And I chose these images because I think a lot of my work is based on Mediterranean precedent. But what I want to talk to you about transcends that precedent. And so I wanted to show you something that was in Asia and in different parts of Asia, and it's related to something that you find in Spain. Because what I'm trying to tell you is that this biophilic design is universal. And so what many of these images that I'm showing you have in common is the concept of a courtyard. A courtyard serves many purposes. It can provide ventilation and lighting. It can serve as a place to gather. It can extend your living spaces, and it can provide quiet refuge from the busy world outside. cultures in a variety of climates across the world have shared this design concept, which is why I'm showing you such a variation here, and they all have that in common, no matter the culture or the climate. And so with a courtyard, you have an instant connection to nature. You don't have this massive building in which you don't have a window to the outside and you have to have a moss installation on your wall to feel connected. Here you create and you take advantage of the sun and the breeze, and you're always finding a way to see the outside or go to the outside, get glimpses because of the way that the buildings are designed. And these courtyards can be done at a monumental scale or in a domestic scale. So with a palace like this, this is in the monumental scale, but then this right here, this is a more humble house, and in the Japanese courtyard house, it's even more humble. And what kind of nature you find inside really depends on the climate and the culture that you're in. So sometimes in Japan, what you have is a sand garden, but that's also nature, the sand, and they find that peaceful. And here you have oranges, you have olive trees. It all depends. And then here, of course, you have lotus, flowers, and in this tea pavilion that is inside a larger courtyard. This concept of a courtyard starts at the macro level and in the arrangement of buildings to create an urban fabric. And it extends to the micro level as a feature inside the individual buildings that make up that fabric. So here I have chosen 4 different cities in very different climates and in very different places of the world. And here we have Fez in Morocco, which is a hot and arid environment. We have Ollantaytambo in Peru, which I have been to, and it is an incredible town because it was built by the Incas, and it has been in continuous inhabitants since the time of the Incas. And unlike Cusco, where the Spaniards built a second story over the Inca foundations, here the houses are still 1 story and they just keep on retouching the roof. And the streets have gutters, that were built by the Incas, and the water flows down the hill, and it's magnificent. And then here you have Copenhagen in Denmark. So this is a cold climate. And then here you have a city in Bali, which is called Tenganan Pegringsingan, and it's in Bali. So this is tropical, warm and humid. And you can see that they all have that in common. Here's my little pointer. You can see all the courtyards in here. You can see them on the micro level, like right there in a house, right there. You see them in the macro level, right there in a public square. In a hot and arid environment, you want to create shadow. So the buildings are put close together so that they create shadows, one on top of another, because that's how you keep cool. You make your walls very thick, and you have very few windows on the outside, and you have a courtyard in the center, hopefully with a fountain. Then the hot air will rise and will cool it. Now here, this is dry, but it's a little more temperate. And so the houses are farther apart, but you still have courtyards, and you have, the macro level. You have the Plaza de Armas, which is, the main plaza, and then inside of the houses you have your courtyards. And then in a cold environment, what you want to do is create, is to retain heat by having mass. So the buildings are more massive, and you probably have double loaded hallways. So you'll have a hallway in the center, and you'll have rooms on either side, and you will have thick walls, and you will consider the orientation of the building so that you're storing thermal mass because it's cold. But guess what? You also have courtyards. We don't want monolithic buildings. So every block is subdivided, whether it's a communal courtyard that different apartments make around, or it's a house, that makes a courtyard, or on a monumental scale, you have that big courtyard. And then here where it's tropical, what you want is airflow. And so these long avenues, and you can see that it's very linear, the houses are arranged so that the breeze runs through the streets. and they're wider streets, but you still have courtyards in the houses, and then the houses and the buildings forming courtyards, which are plazas. And that takes me to the second half of my lecture. Architecture has its own realm. It has a special physical relationship with life. I do not think of it primarily as either a message or symbol, but as an envelope and background for life which goes on, in, and around it. A sensitive container for the rhythm of footsteps on the floor, for the concentration of work, for the silence of sleep. And this is a quote by a Swiss architect by the name of Peter Sumter. And I started by introducing myself and saying who I was, because architecture is an identity. And so I am many things, which is why I told you that I was a mother, a wife, a Hispanic woman, and an architect. I cannot separate architecture from who I am. And the type of architect that I am has to do with so many things, including my cultural identity, my education, and even the very place where I grew up. So this is a picture of one of my favorite cities in Nicaragua. This is Granada, which was named after the city in Spain. This is the cathedral, and you can see, as far as the eye can see, courtyards everywhere. And then on the macro level, you have the big courtyard here with the church, and the town hall, and all of the municipal buildings. But everywhere, you know, these are all individual houses, and they all have courtyards. And they all create courtyards at a public level. Whether it is the impluvium of a Roman house or the public square in a city, the courtyard gives us the perfect lesson in connecting to the environment, creating communion with nature through sightlines and volumes, extending our living spaces into the natural realm without gimmicks, but instead with intention and inevitability. This image of Granada, Nicaragua, brings me to the second part of my musings. How does this ancient approach to biophilia relate to me, Nadia, the Hispanic architect? To answer that question, I must digress into the idea of identity. Architecture is a vocation, an integral part of those of us who feel called to practice it. Architecture is an identity. So this is where I grew up. This is right here, my hometown. This is the Pacific Ocean. This right here is that volcano. And this is where I attended church. I grew up in Chinandega, Nicaragua, a beautiful tropical land full of lakes and active volcanoes. As a child, the connection to the land was always strong. You could see the mighty volcano San Cristobal, this one right there, watching, the tallest in Central America, watching over our town as soon as you stepped outside. And I think that you guys can relate to that, because everywhere I went here, I saw the mountains. And I think that the mountains anchor you to place, right? Like, you know that you're home if you've traveled outside of your city or state, and you find that landmark that makes you feel at home. And so that's what this volcano was for me. The road literally runs right here. So the volcano is right there. Here's the ocean, and the road goes like that, from Alaska to the Patagonia. It's called the Pan American Highway. The landscape of our city gave me security and a sense of place. When we traveled, I knew we were home when I could see the ridges of the Maribio mountain range, a range that our poet laureate Rubén Darío called the vertebral column of the American continent, because it starts in Alaska and ends in the Patagonia. In Nicaragua, this range is explosive and telluric, and home to around 19 active volcanoes. And I have climbed a few of them. And to me, this was home. The volcanoes on the east and the Pacific Ocean on the west, and our hometown nestled in the shade of these giants. So if you're on the street, right behind the church tower, you see the peak of the volcano. These are my parents, and this is on their honeymoon, and this is the last photo I took of the two of them before my dad passed away. It just so happens to be mimicking their honeymoon photo. My parents were teachers. My mom, who is still alive, taught early childhood, and my dad taught geography, history, and most importantly, history of culture. My parents were respected and productive members of our community. My dad was absolutely revered by his students, having taught so many in our town that at the end of his life, he was honored with the title of Maestro de Generaciones, which means teacher of generations. My dad had a master's degree from the University of New Orleans, specifically on adult pedagogy. So he was teaching high school students at first, but then in the late 60s, he got a scholarship to go to New Orleans. And when he went back to Nicaragua, he was teaching adults that had given up for whatever reason, they had given up on their studies. And he was teaching high school, he was teaching night classes. And so being named Teacher of Generations had even more meaning for him, because it wasn't just the high school students that were growing up, but he was literally teaching generations at the same time, and sometimes they were older than him. And this title is the highest honor that an educator can receive in Nicaragua. To find myself today speaking in front of all of you in the hallowed halls of a university would have made him proud. My parents eventually retired from teaching and founded a bookstore, which is to this day a point of reference and a cornerstone of education, since through the bookstore, my mom supplies textbooks to most of the schools in our hometown. So I grew up surrounded by books and listening to scholarly conversations during our family tertulias, which are cultural parties and a big part of Nicaraguan culture. So now I'm going to show you a few pictures of places that I've been that have a lot of meaning for me. So this is the Gate of the Lions in my city, which is, if I remember, maybe like 3 hours from Athens. And if any of you have read the Iliad, this is where Agamemnon sailed from. This was his citadel. And my dad used to read a book, a very thin book, to me, that had, that it was about the Trojan War and the discovery of Trojan by Henry Schliemann, and it had a picture of the Gate of the Lions. And so I made a list of all of the places that my dad was telling me about, and I have visited a lot of them, not all of them, but this was one that I went when I was in college, and it was, one of those surreal moments. Every child loves bedtime stories, and I grew up falling asleep to them. While my mom had an amazing imagination to invent tales, my dad would tell me passages from history, and his words at nighttime were my first school. From him, I learned about Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Ramses II, Cleopatra, Napoleon, about the Incas and the Aztecs, about our brave cacique Nicaragua and his quest to defend our land from the Spanish invaders. He taught me Latin and Greek, and he would quiz me on famous quotes, which I had to answer in their original language. And so here is the Court of the Lions in the Alhambra. And talk about biophilic design here. The fountain in here is a clock, and it has, at different heights, it has these little holes at different heights, and the water fills the basin and starts draining in through the mouths of the lions at every hour, because the holes are placed at different heights, and they come in, at the exact time. But in Muslim design, every single building has a courtyard in the center, and it's divided into quadrants, which represent the four corners of paradise. And then from the fountain in the center, the water runs through the rooms and connects to other rooms. And so connecting to nature is not just, the little tree, but in this case, it's literally water, as a source. And, they're talking about the rivers of paradise, and they're taking water inside of the rooms. And so this channel here would then keep going, and then you have this sitting room where people live, and they, sit around and do their thing, and there's a little fountain in there, and you can follow this water all throughout the Alhambra. And it's just an incredible space. And I had the pleasure of visiting it a few times. There were books everywhere. Books in the bookstore and books in the house. And there were books that illustrated the stories that I heard at night. The books had beautiful imagery, and soon these stories started to take hold of my imagination. And I came to see life in the world in terms of cities, in terms of civilizations. It became a cherished dream for me to travel and see these incredible places with my own eyes. So I chose these images carefully because they're from places that I visited. I visited them first in the words of my father, and as an adult, I have seen them with my own eyes. When I walked through the halls of the Alhambra in Granada, I thought of my dad, and to his memories, I added my own. And here's the Acropolis with the Parthenon, which I also visited. And here is Machu Picchu, which was the trip of a lifetime that my husband and I did when we decided to have children. We went to Peru for 3 weeks because we were not going to have a trip like that, you know, though we have now started taking our children on our travels. And you can see also, I mean, it's missing roofs, but even on the terracing, all of these buildings form courtyards, and they have courtyards inside, just like that. And here in the Acropolis, you know, we're talking in a monumental scale. And so it's a little different. The Parthenon is the object in the center, but all the buildings revolve around it, and they create these outdoor rooms, these courtyards that I've been talking about. While my dad told me stories, my mom, an accomplished artist, master of many media, instructed me in the arts. She taught me to draw and paint and cultivated in me a passion for music, dancing, theater, and poetry. She planned our vacations so that we were always learning, often visiting archaeological sites or historic buildings. Like the one time we drove to Guatemala, and that trip was in 1988. I was 8 years old. The reason for the trip was that my parents wanted to buy books and things that they could sell in the bookstore because Nicaragua was under an embargo. And so we had nothing to sell, we had nothing to buy. And my dad had to quit teaching because as a history professor, he had been told that he had to teach a certain history that was edited and controlled by the government. And he refused to do that. And so his friends told him to retire, and that's when he went, you know, full-time in the bookstore. So we went to Guatemala, and the idea was that in Guatemala City they were going to buy pencils and notebooks and things that we didn't have in Nicaragua and then sell them in the bookstore. And we were in this Volkswagen hippie van that broke down so many times that it took us 3 weeks to go from Nicaragua to Guatemala City, and it took us 2 days to come back. But the car broke down outside of a Mayan archaeological site. And my mom saw this sign. It's called Tazumar, which is just happened to be the most important Mayan archaeological site in El Salvador. And so while my dad and my uncle went to find a mechanic, my mom took us into the pyramid, and we climbed the pyramid. And you know, she was always trying to put education and wonder in our travels. My mom always found an opportunity to teach, and one of my earliest memories is being restless at Mass and having my mom take me through the aisles of the church. And she would tell me, vamos a ver los santos, which means let's go look at the saints. And in old Catholic churches, you know, like these, you know, which are 500 years old, the statues of the saints are in eticules. So I don't know if you guys know what an eticule is, but this right here is sort of an eticule. So it's like a little temple, and then you have a figure right there, you know, or like that's an eticule. So they're like little altars. And my mom would take me, and she was showing me the sculptures. I was looking at the eticules, and I was fascinated by the fine carvings of the 500-year-old altars. And then my mom would tell me even more stories, and she would tell me, for example, that the gold-crusted altar in our church had been whitewashed to prevent the British pirate Henry Morgan, like the one in Captain Morgan, that was a real guy, from stealing it in one of his raids. So here are more pictures of Nicaragua, and this is a city of about 30 minutes from my hometown, called León. And along with Granada, they were the first cities founded in Nicaragua by the Spaniards in about 1512. And here you see more of the volcanoes. My volcano is further, it's off, it's a little further north. And this one is Telica, and this one is called the Casita, which means the little house. And this is the Church of Calvary. And this building right here is now a hotel, but this used to be the high school where my dad went to school. And this is the cathedral, which is the largest in Central America. And folklore in Nicaragua, because our poor country has been through so much that nobody can believe that we can have such a grand cathedral. The folklore is that the floor plans for the cathedral were meant for Peru because it's such a large church, but that they were lost in transit and ended up in Nicaragua. But the reality is that the church was always meant for León. So our architecture, our Nicaraguan architecture. And here's Granada as well. This is another house in Granada. I love looking at buildings, and our culture has so much to offer me. The colonial cities of León and Granada were my playground, and my imagination would run wild as I listened to my dad tell us stories of the War of Independence and show us the places where the events happened. It became clear in my mind that if there was an event, there was a building or a public square that accompanied it, and I decided that I wanted to create buildings. I was 11 years old when I announced to the family that I was going to be an architect. After high school, I moved to Chicago to learn English and apply for college. My brother was my legal guardian since our parents were not US citizens and had remained in Nicaragua. You will notice that I always say I grew up in Nicaragua. I was not born in Nicaragua. I was born in Chicago for medical reasons. And I grew up in Nicaragua. US citizen by birth, Nicaraguan by upbringing. I didn't even have a Nicaraguan passport. I had a fake birth certificate so that my parents could get food in their rationing card for me. And they didn't want me to have a Nicaraguan passport in case we needed to flee. And the US Embassy would check on their US citizens. And so they always wanted me to be just a US citizen and not be tied down to Nicaragua, for fear. Which is happening right now. Every time my mom leaves the country, she has to register with the government because Nicaragua is yet again in another dictatorship. And the fear is that one day, you will not be able to leave, just like in Cuba. So it was an interesting childhood. My brother had a tumultuous upbringing in adolescence because he lived through the war. And the courtyards, they offer you so many things. But one of the things that they offer you is also escape. So one of my core memories is seeing a group of teenage boys coming running through the bookstore in desperation. And it was because the cattle truck that would take the boys to the mountain for the counter-revolutionary war was coming. So if you were 14, but looked like you could be 16 and you had left your house to go to school, the guardia could take you. And you would never come home. Your parents would have no idea what had happened to you. My return, in a body bag, at best. And so I remember the boys came in and they asked for help, and my parents took them into the bookstore, which was attached to our house, took them in the house, took them to the courtyard, and then they said, climb up the columns, go to the roof, and if you walk on the roof in this direction, you can drop down on, a safe house, and from then on, they will guide you so that you can leave the city. So the courtiers, offer salvation to these boys. My brother lived through, how do I scroll down right here? Sorry. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with the notes. I don't know how to switch it over.
I think if you bring the mouse over.
I found it. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so my brother had a tumultuous adolescence. He lived through the war and the triumph of the revolution in Nicaragua, and then he lived through the counter-revolution, and for his safety, my parents sent him to live with our aunt and grandmother in Chicago when he was 13. Because, you know, the story that I'm telling you about the boys, you know, they were not 16, 16 was the age in which you were considered old enough to go to war. But all you had to do was look a little older, and then, you know, they would take you. So my brother grew up in a suburb of Chicago where nobody looked or spoke like us. And it was a place so devoid of Latin people that most of his friends assumed that he was Greek, and they pronounced his last name as Palacios. Growing up in Chicago was a cultural shock for my brother. So when I applied to college, my brother advised me to check the white box in my ethnicity. And that was confusing to me, but I followed his advice. And it bothered me ticking that box. Because sure, I was and I am a US citizen, but I am Hispanic. And I have indigenous and Spanish and African ancestors. And I speak with an accent. And I had never had peanut butter, and I didn't know 90% of the TV shows that my classmates watch, and I had never, do they say watch Forrest Gump? I've seen scenes. I wasn't white, I wasn't American, I was a foreigner, I was a Hispanic immigrant. And ticking that box was very confusing. Why did I have to hide my true self? And I realize now that my brother had suffered discrimination when he presented himself as Hispanic. And given that our family easily passes for white, he had assumed that as his identity. And I remember that I had a Nicaraguan flag in my dorm, and my brother made me take it down. And he said that flags ignited passions, and passions led to war, which, you know, was just his, you know, his childhood trauma. So 2 summers ago, I went to see my brother in the Chicago area, and when I drove up to his house, there was a giant Nicaraguan flag outside of his house. And I said, "Who are you, and what did you do to my brother?" Because he has since been exploring his roots and embracing his Nicaraguanness. So all of those inappropriate boxes checked, I was accepted at my top choice, University of Notre Dame. And you see even more courtyards there. We call them quads at Notre Dame. We have the administration building. That's a little laser pointer. That's the main building, the Golden Dome. Here's the Basilica where I got married. Here's the theater. And here's another administrative building. And here are the quads. And there's another quad. And there are more quads, and there are quads everywhere. Quadrangles. So Notre Dame is full of courtyards. And the buildings form courtyards within themselves as well. So I was accepted at the prestigious School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame, where the curriculum of the School of Architecture promised an education grounded in history and required a year abroad in Italy. So it's a dream come true. This is some of my student work. This is a library in Slovenia, which revolves around a courtyard, you guessed it. And you enter, and it was inspired by a local architect by the name of Joseph Pleshnik, and he was kind of an Art Deco, a precursor of Art Deco, even though his work was from the late 1800s. He was a visionary, and he was part of the Vienna secessionist movement. And there was a big narrative in his design of the library, you know, that inspired my class to design this library. A narrative, which is why I'm telling you my own story, is so important in architecture. And when I work on my day-to-day basis, I make little stories. Sometimes they're stories about my client's life, or sometimes they're just, you know, plainly made up, but everything needs to have meaning. So in here, you come in through the Hall of Night. So the vestibule is dark and stormy right there. And the constellation of Pegasus is in the ceiling because Pegasus is the vehicle of the Muses. The Library of Alexandria was called a museum, or a house of the Muses. So the first library was a museum. That's what museum means, house of the Muses, house of the inspiration. So when you're outside, you have Pegasus right there. And, you know, Pegasus invites you to ride him into the night and up the tumultuous journey of learning until you get to the reading room, which is flooded with light, the light of knowledge. So I received a classical education at Notre Dame. In my experience at Notre Dame was the opposite of my brothers at Northwestern, because the School of Architecture valued diversity, and I was taught by professors of various nationalities and cultural backgrounds. At Notre Dame, I learned the value of place, something that resonated with my upbringing. I didn't have to hide myself. I was actually encouraged. I learned that understanding the culture and idiosyncrasies of people was paramount to good design. I learned that humans have been looking for solutions to stand up to gravity and protect themselves from the weather, and though separated by oceans, the solutions tend to be similar from one culture to another, which I showed you at the beginning with the different climates and in the courtyard design. I learned that as people we have more in common with one another than we realize. And I learned even more history, and all the places in the background of my dad's stories now came alive in analysis and as inspiration for design. At the end of my college education, I chose as my thesis a site large and empty in the outskirts of my hometown, and I designed a school for the arts. That Christmas break, I went back to Nicaragua, and I immersed myself in research, visiting all the homes of my childhood and seeing them with fresh new eyes, trying to distill the ethos of our Nicaraguan civilization so that I could translate it into my final schoolwork. So these are some of the pictures that I took. And this is in Granada, that's the city hall. And this is a house, also in Granada. And another house in Granada. These are all different houses. And they all have this courtyard, and then the buildings revolve around that courtyard. And you are never far from some little tree or some little fountain, or just plainly seeing the sky. And these were the lessons that I learned. And the encaustic floors, the white walls, the columns, the textures, the carvings, the patterns, all of that, stays with me to this day. I passed my thesis review with honors, and that research exercise left in me much more than a grade. It engraved lessons in my mind and in my heart that I carry to this day. The way the houses respond to the climate, how the structures line the streets and create outdoor rooms of public spaces, the way the rooms in the houses succeed one another without hallways. And if I was your reviewer on Friday, you heard me talk about removing hallways and having rooms one after the other. There's a reason for that, and these lessons come from here. In architecture speak, that's called an enfilade, which means in a line. The colors and the textures of the buildings, the intricate geometry of the encaustic floors, all of this I carry with me. So now to my work. After graduation, I apprenticed for a variety of firms until the spring of 2009, when during the recession, I lost my job and found myself at a crossroads. And this is what I call making margaritas out of lemons. I decided that I wouldn't go back to working for someone else, and instead decided to start my own office in the middle of a recession. A friend of mine asked me to help her remodel her office. And I thought she was asking me for free advice, because you will find out that if you're studying architecture or when you become an architect, everyone will ask you for free design advice. And she followed her request by saying, "And I'll pay you." And I thought, I can get paid. And that was it. I paid $1 to the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, and I had a business. In the words of Julius Caesar, like my dad taught me before he crossed the Rubicon, I said, "Alea jacta est," which means fortune has been thrown. And thank God for my wonderful husband who supported me, because I really was not making any money. And we could have easily ended bankrupt. But it started as bathroom remodels and helping people pick tile for their pools, or designing a porch, or selecting a sofa, until one day someone took a chance on me and they hired me to remodel a large and very well-known mansion in River Oaks, which is this house that you see here. This was my first major project. The residence was French in style, and it had a very prominent bronze door, which you can sort of see here, right there, shining. So River Oaks is the poshest neighborhood in Houston, and this house is in a subdivision of River Oaks called Tall Timbers. And people know this house, and they know the door. And it took us 3.5 years. And the entire time I was just saying to myself, don't screw it up, because if you do, everyone knows that bronze door, and you will be known as the person that ruined that house. But instead, whoops, what did I do? So sorry. There we go. Sorry. Still having trouble switching over. Okay. Well, I know what follows. I did not ruin the house, clearly. Instead, the house was published in House Beautiful and won a bunch of awards. And the owner of the house is one of Houston's best dressed. And we say that we've done 3 projects for her now, in the house and outside of the house, and her brother is my client. And we say that she's more than a client, she's a patron. She's our patroness, she's our patron saint. And so I now want to show you some examples of my work, and I want to show you how this idea of biophilia and also my Hispanic identity, which is tied to biophilia, permeate through all of the work that I do. So I'm going to go back to this one. It's a lot easier to design with this connection to nature in mind when you're starting from scratch. But in this house, I was able to do it. The house was a rabbit hole of hallways, doors banging into doors. So I got rid of all of that and opened up the spaces, created access. And one thing that I did in this room right here, go back, which is our most Instagrammed image, and I find it hilarious sometimes when my clients put it on Pinterest and then they show it to me, like, oh, I like this room, like I designed that. So right outside of this window, there is a little formal parterre garden, and I told the landscape architect that I was putting this design here on the ceiling. And his training was more of a modernist, and so he was having a bit of a hard time coming up with formal gardens for what is a very formal house. And so I showed him my design, and I said, this is a parterre, which is a French garden. You know, it means on the earth, and you have very intricate geometric designs. And I didn't want to just have a flat ceiling, and I didn't want to have beams, and this being a French house, I decided that I was going to have the geometry of a parterre garden in the ceiling. And so I gave him that, and he put it right outside, and he repeated the parterre on the actual parterre right here. And we created all these sight lines for the house and a garden room here on an exterior courtyard that I also created, and brought the outdoors by virtue of all of these openings and access, you know, and you have rooms and enfilade that go through, you see all the enfilade through there, and virtually 0 hallways to connect you with the outside. So this is for your eyes only. This is going to be published next spring in Southern Home. So people have not seen this house. And this is the house of a friend of mine who is an interior designer. And the biggest honor for me as an architect is when a fellow design professional asks me to design their house because they are discerning people. And so they're going to ask for someone who is as discerning as them. And so this was another remodel. And I created this extension right here, and this extension right here that creates an outdoor room for the family to hang out. And all the rooms in this area of the house look out into this courtyard, and you're just never too far from the exterior. And here you see other views of that courtyard, and then an actual outdoor space. Here an open outdoor space there, and then the interior of that room where you sit here and you have light on both sides. And then you can go outside, but you know, you're here in the breakfast nook, and you can see the pool, you can see the trees, and you're very connected to the world outside. And then here's the kitchen where you have another big window that connects you, and that window is that window right there. So it's literally in the middle of this little courtyard. And then this is the garden room in a historic Houston house that someone had the terrible idea to completely cover. And so when I started restoring the house, because we do a lot of historic restoration, someone had put these awful sponged blue painted columns in this room. So of course I removed the columns. I was done in the 90s. And when I removed the columns, I realized that all the original doors were inside the walls and they were intact. So I refurbished the windows, created gardens outside, and now we're back to it being a garden room. And it's very transparent. That's the exterior. Here's another view with a fountain there. And you're really, in the canopy of those beautiful live oak trees that are so prevalent in Houston. And this is a house in my neighborhood. So it's a cottage of sorts, I guess, though a rather big cottage. And this was my first new construction project. And the floor plan has become something of a signature of mine, though I don't do it on purpose, it just works. It's H-shape. And so you see how these rooms have light on both sides, two sides of windows. And then here as well, you have this other little courtyard. And you don't have any hallways. And then, you have the pool there. And I believe that this is a video. Can I play the video?
If you just hit enter, maybe?
There we go. Thank you. So this is designed in the vernacular of my neighborhood. But it's a very large house for the neighborhood, which is why I broke it up in those masses like that, where you have single room, and you see it in the plan. You have single room, single volume rooms, as opposed to rooms, that are butted to each other. So the only area where that happens is in the family room, right here in the center. But there you see the plan that is kind of H-shaped, the pool in the back, and every side of the house has some sort of cool little garden, like a fire pit. That showed the tree house that was on the lot when my clients bought the house, which is right here. So we had to preserve the tree and the tree house. And there was this whole sequence, this is an alley. And so the elderly parents come in their car and they park here and they walk through on grade, and then there is a lift right here that takes them up to the house. The house is actually quite a few feet above the ground. It's pier and beam. And then they take an elevator and that takes them upstairs. And that whole sequence was one of the hardest things to do, to get that to work. And the roof, to connect these two things, which had to be simple, like I told you guys in your review, but it was two volumes that didn't want to be connected, and yet they had to be. And this is another new construction, also in River Oaks, and a much larger scale. But you can see how it's one volume, really. So this is one room, that's one room, that's one room, and then here's a courtyard for you to come in, and you have light, several sides of the rooms, and there's a single hallway on the second floor that is here and connects the various rooms. But other than that, there is no superfluous circulation. So just like in the courtyard houses of Nicaragua, where you just have the hallway around the courtyard, that's sort of how I design. And I create courtyards out of English Tudor buildings. So here's another view. There's the hallway, and you see single mass, and you get light on both sides. And that's the video of the house, so that you can see how it sits on the lot. And the roof is rather simple, which is what a roof should be. But I also try to break up the mass because it is a massive house. It is 12,000 square feet. And so I don't want it to feel like a blob, which is why I designed with little appendages. And eventually there will be a pool right here. It's just the house is fairly new, so they haven't built the pool. And this is one of our site plans. So I have my own landscape department because the way that I was taught in school, and I brought this up during the review, is that the professors would always ask us a question. How does a building meet the ground? And how does a building meet the sky? And so how does a building meet the ground is answered with the urban fabric, with the siding of the building, with the context of the building. And you know, these houses are, you know, large houses and, you know, private communities. They're not urban places, but I designed them in an urban way, you know, so each lot has that element that I showed you earlier, you know, of the urban fabric. And sometimes that element is the house with an office and a little pool pavilion and then a pergola here completing that courtyard. But I'm always creating these little cities, these little courtyard houses. And that is my answer to that question, you know, how the building meets the ground. That has to do with context and how the buildings engage with their surroundings. And how does the building meet the sky is answered in the previous one, you know, with the massing of the building, you know, the silhouette of the building and the scale and proportion of the building. So this is a historic house in Houston that was designed by John Staub, a very revered architect in Texas. And the house ends here, and we are restoring the house. We're adding this to the house. We're adding a little window here, and then this little extension, and a portico share, and we're adding a sunroom here on the first floor. And it's gonna look like a sleeping porch, but it's really part of the master bedroom upstairs because the clients are really old and they want an elevator right here to go to the second floor. And then we're adding an artist studio for the wife. There is a greenhouse right here, blue house there, and then the pergola. And all together, you know, that creates that courtyard that I have been showing you. So the other buildings complete the composition. And it can be tightly knit, like the places in Morocco, or it can be loosely configured, like this, you know, where you have a lot of greenery, and the trees themselves make up walls. And in my office, we think of landscape design as creating outdoor rooms. So it's not just random moments of nature, but they're actually creating spaces outside, and they are completing the spaces that we are creating inside. So here as well, we have a little fountain outside of the breakfast room, and we have this path that goes down to this magnificent live oak here that we are saving. And so we have rooms outside and we have rooms inside. And this is the site plan of another new house. And this one is kind of a Norman style house. And we have an entry court, you know, as you come here, and you're received by these terraces. And the house is rather flat because the lot has a very punishing setback, which is this dashed line that's here. It's 85 feet from the front of the property. So I'm breaking it up a little bit. I'm trying the house to have it meet the sky and not be a blob. So it breaks up a little bit like that. But then when we're in the back, the volume of the house can really take place. And here is our courtyard. We have a pool house. We have paths that complete, you know, with garden walls that complete that courtyard, the family room, the garage, you know, all of that creates this space here that is very inward looking. And we recently toured the house with the clients in framing, and this is the husband's office. And he can see, just like that other breakfast room, from all three sides of his office, he can see his property. And then this is the wife's office. She gets only one window with her yoga garden, but she's a fitness influencer. And so above this room, she has a gym. And from that gym, she gets to see down on all her property, just like her husband. And so the house presents a very stoic facade along the street, but when you're inside, if you're privileged enough to be invited, you're in this wonderful private world of the courtyard. And then this is an English garden here with little pergolas and culminating into a fountain. And then this house is the pride and joy of our office currently. A few years ago, when my husband and my children and I were in San Diego and we went to Balboa Park, which is very Spanish in style. These are buildings from an international fair that were done in the Churrigueresco, which is a particular style of Spanish architecture. I said, nobody has hired me to do a Spanish style house. I am a Hispanic architect. Like, I freaking grew up in Latin America. I live and breathe Hispanic architecture, and nobody has asked me to do it. Because the trend lately has been white Tudor with black windows. And so this is the brother of that client that opened doors for me, and they're not Hispanic, they just love Hispanic architecture. So when we came back from San Diego, I posted a picture on my Instagram and I said, I'm manifesting to the universe a Spanish style house. And so lo and behold, here it is. And this is a house that cannot be completed without the landscape. This house does not work without its landscape. Right now the house is under construction and all of this property here is blank. So when you come up to the house, it's just a white stucco house. And unfortunately, I couldn't get a good picture for you guys because we are ramming towards completion, and so all of this is just full of cars, and you cannot get a sense of it. But you can go on my Instagram and you can see some drone footage of the house and more pictures. But it doesn't make sense right now because it doesn't have the landscape. So with this house, I really have enjoyed myself. I have indulged every single Hispanic architecture dream in this project. So we start here in the entry court. We have an alley of trees, and we come into a formal entry court, with the four corners, just like at the Alhambra, the four quarters of paradise and the fountain in the center. And then we come through here in the entry hall, but we call it the Sawan. So a Sawan is the connection between the courtyard and the street in a Spanish or house in Latin America, a Hispanic house. And in old times, you would actually drive inside of the Sawan with your horses. And that is where you would leave your horse and it would take you directly into the courtyard. So this house does have a courtyard. It has a cortile right here. It has columns. And now it has a void here, so it's not a complete donut, but the pool house completes the courtyard, and it is a lot tighter than some of the other courtyards that I've shown you. And the clients have run with it. So the clients call it the Sawan. I labeled it like that when we went for building permit. The permit official was mystified by that, and we call it the Sawan. I decided in my office that anything that had to do with water had to have a Moorish inspiration. So this is the husband's office right here. And again, he can see from different sides. He can see his property. And we gave it this little porch that has these day beds here and has a walled garden, which we call the Riyadh, which literally it means walled garden. So it has a little plunge pool, and it will be covered in Salish tiles brought from Morocco. And these are garden walls, completely secluded, so nobody can see you. And then the pool house, and there are pictures of it on my Instagram, the pool house is full Moroccan. So we went big, with the pool, and we call that the hammam, because it is a hammam. And a hammam is based on the Roman baths, where you would have the caldarium, which is the sauna right here. It's a hot room. And then you would have the frigidarium, which is the cold room, which is here, where you're going to cool off. This is the palestra, which is the gym. This is the natatio, which is the pool. So we decided that we were not going to call it a pool house. It can be a pool house. It's a hammam, which is the heir to the Roman baths, preserved by the Muslim architects of the Alhambra. And then here, we're going to have orange trees on rolling carts so that we can protect them whenever we have a hurricane or a freeze, because that happens all the time in Texas. But it's a very Spanish courtyard, because there's nothing more Spanish than a patio de los naranjas, a courtyard of oranges. So when you're in this house, the house sees itself from every angle. You come in, and then you're in the living room, and you see all of your domain from there, and then you're in the dining room, and again, you see the house and the house looks at you. And even in areas here, we have little courtyards. You know, this little game room has its own little private garden. And you have views from all angles, private little gardens from all angles. And the house looks at you and you look at the house. And upstairs, right here, we have a single hallway that goes from that stair to that stair. And that is the only hallway in the entire house. And I end with that because that project is awesome. Any better than that. But I'm going to leave you with some thoughts. Architecture is the theater of life. For in buildings, we live, we work, we study, we dream, we pray, we cry, and we rejoice. Architecture is one of the few professions that impacts everyone that encounters it, and we architects have the unique privilege of shaping the world we live in. It is an awesome and daunting responsibility. So I leave you with a picture of my family. My husband John, my son Alexander, my son Lorenzo. I am a mother, a wife, a Hispanic woman, and I am an architect. That is my identity. What is your identity? What is your sense of place? How are you going to shape the world with who you are? And how are you going to connect nature to your buildings and to your sense of self? Thank you. Please.
What would you say are the core elements architecturally of the sort of Spanish mission style Central American architecture?
The courtyard would be the first thing. So that is something that is pretty much universal in all of that architecture. And then, you know, you have a lot of stucco. But it's really it's very, very diverse. And I learned a lot when designing this house. Because even though I've lived it my whole life and I've traveled, I realized that I didn't have measure drawings, you know, that I hadn't studied it, except for my thesis, you know, I hadn't studied it in detail. And I started studying it more, and it is so diverse. And so I think the only thing that you can say is common to it is that the buildings are made usually out of masonry with stucco on them, and that they're gonna have a courtyard and a sawan to enter the courtyard. But outside of that, it's really dependent on the local culture and the local architecture. And so, for example, in Peru, the buildings have these balconies on the outside that have a lot of carved, they're not rejas, they're not made of iron, they're made of wood. And they extend light from the inside of the building onto the street. So these balconies are like boxes that hang off the facades of the buildings, and they hover over the plazas. And you don't find that in other places. You only find that, you know, in Peru. In Mexico, you find such colorful, you know, architecture. Like the houses are painted, you know, hot pink and blue. And then you go somewhere else, and all you see is white. So you have to realize that it's not a monolithic culture. They all have the same DNA. You know, they all come from Spain, and Spain inherited that from the Romans. But other than that, it's a huge diversity. And I had a lot of fun, you know, dwelling into my own culture, you know, to design this house. And I took a friend, a fellow architect, and she's a mentor of mine. And I took her around the house, and she said, Nadia, this doesn't look, you know, like Spanish architecture. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she was thinking Santa Barbara style. And I said, that's a gringo version of what architecture is. And that was like people in the 20s, you know, distilling certain ideas and creating their own style. but that's not what Hispanic architecture is. And so in here, I mixed so many different influences, you know, to where it's just, you know, like, I guess the greatest hits in my mind, you know, of what that Hispanic architectural tradition is. But it starts with the form, and the form is the colors. Any other questions?
Could you talk to us a bit more about how you approach a classical floor plan with modern needs, like garages, elevators? Because this is a beautiful floor plan.
Thank you. Sure. So one thing, you know, that people want is big open kitchen. So the kitchen is here, and we wanted to show the side plan, so unfortunately it's not showing, you know, all the things inside. But this right here is the kitchen. And I am allergic to an open floor plan. So it has, you know, a cased opening, but this is the family room. So I have a kitchen with family room. Like, I cannot escape that. People want that. But the spaces are always going to be defined. So you're never gonna find me designing a blob of a, you know, open floor plan. But I designed with so many sidelines and big cased openings and, you know, so much openness within the definition that people say, oh, it's such an open house, and there's nothing open about it. So, you know, this house has an elevator right here. That's a very modern amenity, you know, the open kitchen. It has a bar right here because his family entertains a lot for fundraising and charity. It has a wine room right here, which cannot be in the basement because we live in a swamp. Normally that would have been in the basement. We do other things. I hide all of the air conditioning. Let me see if I have a picture of that. Here's a slot diffuser right there. I'm gonna hide it within the moldings. Of course, you know, all of the appliances are paneled. So these are refrigerators, they're hidden. Somewhere in here, there's an air return and a beautiful grill. Let's see. I don't think that you can see it. Well, I don't know if you can see right there. There's a little pattern. Those are custom AC grills. So we work with the mechanical engineer to know where the registers are going to be. And because we design such intricate ceilings, we don't want, you know, the vents to ruin it. And so we plan where they go, and then we design patterns that get cut custom to cover the grills. I also like to use very small square recess lights that don't have trim, so that they can be hidden in the millwork or so that you can plaster. And I am very, very particular about recess lights. They have to have a baffle. They have to have an anti-glare cover because I'm always thinking of the lights when they're off. And lighting consultants and engineers, you know, they're obsessed, you know, with you seeing the guts of the lights. And so you have the recess light, and they usually don't give it a baffle. So when the lights are off, you see the black space obliquely through the light, and then you can see all the guts of the house. And then you realize that the ceiling is false, like the ceiling here, right? There's structure above it, and this ceiling right here is not solid. And so you're essentially seeing behind the curtain of the artifice. And nobody wants to see the guts. Maybe in a modern building you want to, but in these houses you don't. And so I make sure that my lights are very, very discreet. So they're 2.5 inches, it's about this big, but they produce a cone of light just as big as one of these. And when the lights are off, you don't know that they're there. And they're not very deep, so they don't create a shadow, and that's how we make them disappear. So I try to hide all of the systems. But then, you know, we'll have a classical house with all the modern, you know, amenities. And I don't think that the two have to be at odds. And there are ways, you know, to hide appliances and equipment. Let's see what else we have in here that we hit. In this case, because the owner is an interior designer, she didn't want to do recessed lights, so we just went with lights everywhere. But yeah, right there, the slot diffuser, you know, you have to look for it. When you're standing in the kitchen, the molding hides it. So we do a lot of that stuff. This one right here, you don't see it, but there is a really beautiful AC grill. Because my motto also is that if you have to see it, then it has to be beautiful. So light switches, we do brass light switches. You know, like if you're gonna see the light switch, it has to be the most beautiful light switch that there ever was. And that is how I blend, you know, classical with modern necessities. Other questions? Yes, Hayden,
The other day when we were
right?
Yeah. I remember the other day when we were chatting, you talked about selling lower ceilings to your clients and talking about those proportional spaces. Could you maybe talk more about that?
Oh, sure.
Why that's important to you?
That you sort of see it, this is a little one right here, where I lowered it and I made it into this thick threshold. So this right here could have easily been 2 jambs with a recess in between. And instead, I made the jam super thick and I did the panel and then I lowered the ceiling right there. So often, and then in the breakfast room, that ceiling is much lower because you see how this ceiling goes up in the living room? I could have easily matched that ceiling to the living room, but then the scale in the breakfast room would have gotten lost. And so it's just all about proportion, you know? In a powder room, sometimes I will even lower the ceiling to 7'6". 7 feet being the minimum height for, you know, for living. And some people think I'm crazy. Sometimes I really have to fight the clients on it, and I tell them, you know, that you experience big spaces through compression. So if every room in a building is huge, you get lost in that room. You need to have hierarchy of spaces, and the ceiling helps you with that. And so vestibules, you know, antechambers before another room is so important. If I go to the Spanish floor plan, or even my tutor, in my tutor floor plan, you know, for example, this room right here is 14 feet tall. So this hallway here is 9 feet. You come in here at 9'6" in the entry, and then you get compressed down to 9 feet, and then the room explodes at 14. And it wouldn't be the same feeling if that was 14. That would feel very narrow. It would just be very awkward. And so we lowered it right here. And then the bathroom gets lowered furthermore to 8 feet because these are small spaces. So they should have a shorter ceiling. And when you come out of the bathroom, you feel a sense of relief in a bigger room. And then when you come in here, you feel the space even more. And so I do that all the time. And even in my schoolwork, because that's where I learned it, in school, you see short ceiling, and then this room was taller because there was a skylight that gives you a glimpse of the light that you will receive in the reading room. You know, and so you get compressed as you're going on this staircase through the turmoil of your learning process. You get compressed in here. You start big actually, and I decided to make this door even shorter when you get up there so that you see the light, and seeing the light makes you want to keep going. And then you get to the reading room and it's like, oh, thank God. And that's a narrative that I told myself. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you, Nadia.